Welcome very, very much to Conversations, where tonight we're doing programming with two people who have had an interest in and have written about a newly emerging aspect of the overall computer industry or computer development that is called artificial intelligence. And it's a very, very interesting topic area representing, I think, both theoretically and increasingly in an entrepreneurial sense, a leading edge capability in terms of computer capability. It's the development of computers that can think as human beings would think if they were thinking intelligently. But it's computers that offer a brand new sense of capability in terms of computer technology. Extremely exciting, and as I say, we've been learning a great deal here on Conversations about this fast-moving and very, very relevant, important field, and would hope that you might be able to from the programming that's upcoming tonight. We have two interviews. The first is with Ed Rosenfeld, who's the editor, publisher, and founder of a newsletter, a very relevant, important newsletter that, in a sense, covers that aspect of computing, artificial intelligence, called Intelligence. And that's our lead-in interview with Ed. And then that's followed by an interview with Pamala McCormuck, who's the co-author of a very important and relevant book that's recently been published called The Fifth Generation, which is reference to a coming fifth generation of computing capability. And that book also calls attention to the fact that the Japanese, along with MITI, the government and entrepreneurial or business interests in Japan, have been seeing the implications of this computer capability and have been building a very, very well thought out long-term development of toward computer technology, the fifth generation, and it could be seen and is by many to be seen as representing a real challenge to the United States to maintain the traditional leadership role we've had in computing science and in developing the business application of computers as we increasingly enter the informational environment that is so characteristic of our of the contemporary time. So happy to bring you those two. Lead in then again with Ed Rosenfeld, who's the editor of the Intelligence, and followed by the interview with Pamala McCormuck, the fifth generation. I hope you very much enjoy the program. We certainly did, and we will be doing more on this particular very, very interesting and relevant topic in future editions of Conversations. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the program. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the series Ed Rosenfeld. Mr. Rosenfeld is the editor and the publisher of a relatively new but very important newsletter called Intelligence. And Ed, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Glad to be here, Harold.
I wonder if you might just maybe briefly share your own background. You've had an interest in technology, technological development. You've done a considerable amount of publishing in that. And then maybe if you could just spell out briefly your own background that led up to your publishing this very interesting newsletter, Intelligence, that has to do with artificial intelligence and so forth. But you've been interested in technology and the expansion of our information technologies really over a considerable period of time, haven't you?
Well, I've been interested in a variety of developments, both technical and also intellectual.
Yeah.
And in the early 1970s, I co-edited some books called Real Time that tried to track the developments going on across many different disciplines. And as a matter of fact, that was the first opportunity that I had to write about artificial intelligence, which is what my newsletter focuses on now.
Yeah.
And through the years, as one of the founding editors of Omni magazine and as a consultant to a variety of communication concerns like CBS News and Group W Cable and Psychology Today and a variety of other companies, I've been very, very interested in communicating information about change.
Yes.
Quite a bit of that has to do with technical change, but not exclusively about technical change. I've also been very interested in the mind.
Yes.
And in the development of consciousness, especially more recently. I did a book a few years ago called The Book of Highs about different ways to alter consciousness.
Yes.
And I see all of these interests that I've had in change and in technology and in consciousness kind of coming together today around the computer.
Yes.
And that's why I started my newsletter, was to, my newsletter is subtitled The Future of Computing, and I call it Intelligence because I think that's what the future of computing is to more widely distribute intelligence.
To more widely distribute and extend intellectual capability in a certain sense. It's an extension of our consciousness. The technology is in a real sense. And it's getting closer to mimicking the human mind, or how close are we getting? When we say artificial intelligence, what do we mean really when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Well, one of the founders of the discipline is a professor at MIT named Marvin Minsky, and I always quote his definition because it seems to me the easiest to comprehend, and it kind of demystifies artificial intelligence. Minsky says that artificial intelligence is getting a computer to do something that if a human did it, it would be considered intelligent.
Oh, well, that's a pretty broad definition in a sense, you know, but yeah,
And so I think what's happening now, both in the field of artificial intelligence and also in a variety of other fields, is that we are using what we understand about intelligence and using what we understand about the way our own minds work and trying to imbue that knowledge into machines so that they can aid us and abet us in our conduct of our daily lives, which is everything from very capital-intensive technological things like robotics and automation and computer-aided design, but also in creativity. I worked on a book called Computer Images, which showed all the different ways in which computers can be used to generate imagery. And I think that computers are going to have an impact on our lives that is really quite monumental, and I think computers are now finally starting to change in a way that I can report on with great glee, because they're no longer the tools of shall we say, a priesthood of data processing professionals. They're no longer the tools reserved for a group that has some subset of esoteric knowledge, but will soon be a tool very much like the telephone. And by that I mean that computers will become an invisible technology. We will be less aware of the tool and more aware of what it does for us.
You know, it might even be going on in our lives with us quite unaware of the fact that it's there. It'll just blend in more or less with all kinds of service and information services and intellectually refined capabilities that will become part of our everyday life that would have been undreamed of even 5, 10, 15 years ago. But I mean, it's moving so very, very quickly.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
The example I like to give is when you're in the middle of an important telephone conversation, you're not at all aware of the technology. Even if you've got the telephone in your hand, you're not conscious that you're using a tool or using a piece of technology. What you're focused on is what that technology makes possible.
The communication.
The communication.
Right.
And that means that the tool, the technology itself, has become invisible. And I think we're approaching that intersection in the changeover of computers from this esoteric tool or technology to one that will soon be invisible, and we start to take computers more and more for granted. A very good example is most of us have bank cards, and we go and deal with a computer at the bank. We're concerned with getting the money into or out of the bank and not with using the computer, even though that tool facilitates our moving that money.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of technology that's behind that has to be all worked out. And we're learning more all the time from the biological sciences about the operation of a mind, about the operation of consciousness, or understanding of consciousness. And the examples from the biological sciences are being able to be applied to computer capabilities and so forth. Are we mimicking the human mind in terms of these increasingly, or how close are we becoming to the complexities of the human mind? It's incredibly complex.
Well, I think our understanding of the human mind is in its infancy.
All right.
We're just starting to map the brain, and there's some educated guesses about the connections between brain and mind, but no one's solved either the brain-mind problem or the mind-body problem, to my knowledge. Right. There's some very exciting things, some things that I've recently been reporting on in the computing area that do make use of a lot of biological research and neurophysiological research. But maybe we could step back just a little bit, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about artificial intelligence and about the different generations of computers, and then we'll come back around to the biological sciences.
All right.
The Japanese have really provoked a lot of what's going on in the world today in terms of where computers are trending toward. They did this by, in 1981, stepping back and taking a long-term look at what was going to happen in computing. And what they did was they initiated a project which is known as the 5th Generation Computer Project. And what this refers to is a variety of different generations of computers. The first generation of computers used vacuum tubes, like we used to have in radios, in order to drive them.
Yes, fill gigantic rooms and so forth.
Exactly.
What a microchip can do now.
Precisely. And the second generation of computers came about because of the Bell Labs invention of the transistor. And then some very smart people figured out how to put a lot of transistors into one small package, which is called the integrated circuit or chip. So now we're at the 3rd generation. We have tubes, transistors, integrated circuits. The 4th generation has just come about in the last 3 or 4 years, and that's integrated circuits of a very, very high density. Tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of transistors and other components packed onto one chip, oftentimes smaller than a baby's fingernail.
Incredible, yeah.
And the Japanese looked at this environment with the beginning of what's called very large-scale integration, that 4th generation, or VLSI technology, and said, well, what's the future of computers? Is it going to be more densely packed? Is it going to use other material other than silicon that maybe will allow the computers to operate faster? Well, what they saw was that and more. They saw that computers would soon start to mimic the human mind. And so they said, let's put together a long-term cooperative program between government and Japanese industry.
MITI, they have a working relationship.
This is the group that put it together in Japan, is the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, which is known as MITI. And they started something called the Institute for New Generation Computing to build what they were calling the 5th generation of computers. And these are computers that would work more like humans work in terms of their rational, logical abilities. Now, there's a real breakthrough and a real revolution. One of the pioneers of AI in America, Ed Feigenbaum from Stanford, talks about this being only the 2nd generation of computers. Because what it really represents is the transition from data processing to symbolic processing. All computers, up until most recently, have operated by reducing everything to data. That is, to a binary language, 0, 1, yes, no, on, off. And what's happening now is we're starting to develop computers that are capable of processing far more complex symbols than just zeros or ones.
Toward pattern recognition?
Well, that's where it's all trending. And as a matter of fact, several people talk about the 6th generation of computing, the 5th generation being artificial intelligence, the 6th generation being the ability of a computer to look at a frame of video in real time and have the pattern recognition capability that will enable it to understand everything that's going on in that frame of video. The visual image as well as the sound.
Gee, that's a tremendous amount of computer capability to be able to get all those signals and simultaneity between sensory perception and so forth.
We can't do it yet.
No, I wouldn't have thought.
But there's a hope that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps in the next decade, we'll start to develop the prototypes of this 6th generation computing.
But the Japanese really had a great impetus toward increasing knowledge or understanding of this large-scale look at the... Would that include what they call the supercomputers? And
well, the Japanese have a separate program for developing supercomputers. Supercomputers are very, very large computers with enormous memory stores and very, very fast processing speeds. But all these supercomputers are really that 1st generation of data processing computers.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about 2 other breakthroughs that I am interested in the computing area. But just to circle back to the Japanese, by starting this 10-year 5th generation or new generation computing program, they woke up the world. They said, in essence, there is a future to computing, even though nobody else is paying a whole lot of attention to it.
Well, hadn't researchers and so forth in this country and so forth been paying attention to those things, or we haven't been paying sufficient attention, or
absolutely,
the degree of the
but the biggest revolution in computing in this country in the last 5 years has been the personal computer, which has represented the true decentralization of computer power. If it had been left to most of the data processing professionals, I don't think there would have been a personal computing industry. There would have been a data processing department, but decentralizing that power and putting a computer on every worker's desk or even on every player's desk, that's a very, very exciting concept.
Yeah, well, we didn't probably have a technology that permitted us to do it until we had the microchip and some of these kind of things that made
well, the
that
integrated
possible.
circuit made it possible, but I think that there was a lot of resistance in terms of the data processing community. I think that the data processing community looked at this as their bastion of knowledge, and they knew how best to use it. And I think the personal computing explosion was a real surprise. But not to say that people in the data processing community weren't looking at the future of computing. They very much were. The Japanese looked at it in a long-term way. MIDI, because of its structure and because of the structure of Japanese industry and government, was able to put together this program to develop this new generation of computers. And in a sense, MIDI forced many of the major computer makers and other high technology companies to participate in that new generation computing program in Japan. And this woke up a lot of computer professionals in America. And a lot of them started to look and say, if we're not quick, and if we don't answer this challenge, we're going to lose a very, very important leadership role that we've maintained for 2 or 3 decades in the computing community.
In which the United States had done, even though they might be losing ground in some industrial areas around the world and so forth, they've maintained their leadership role in terms of information technology.
Very much in the advance of computing and what was going on in computing. The United States was truly dominant. So the Japanese have always been thought of as people who imitated rather than innovated. And this was the first major challenge that the Japanese mounted in a nationalistic way. And not only did America start to formulate responses, but the British have done so, the Europeans have done so, and some of the other more technologically advanced South Pacific area countries have also begun to look at the future of computing and what they can do with it.
And what do we see as we look at the future of computing and what we can do with it from your perspective now?
Well, I think we see that revolution that I referred to in the transition from data processing to symbolic processing.
Maybe you could spell
what if we could take the way an expert thinks about a problem and put it into a machine? Then we could bring that machine around where the expert might not go. And I'll give you a very specific example. Schlumberger, which is a major multinational corporation, is in the oil field services business. And they have a program called Drill Bit Advisor, which is what's known as an expert system. And this is a symbolic processing computer program. And this isn't exactly the way it developed, but let me at least use this metaphor. They had 2 experts in oil well drilling bits. And one day one was in Alaska, and the other was in Saudi Arabia, and a field in Venezuela went kaflooey. And they couldn't bring these 2 experts in, and yet they needed to know what kind of oil drill bit to use. So what they ended up doing, Schlumberger bought Fairchild Semiconductor because they had advanced research into this development of what are called expert systems. And they took the knowledge of these 2 men and of other people and put that knowledge into a computer program. And the way they could do this was through this symbolic processing, because the kind of program it was put their knowledge into the computer as a series of logical rules. If the satellite data and the ore samples and the ground samples tell us that where we're drilling is X, then we need to use bit Y. So we have a series of rules, if, then, if, then. And this is applicable across disciplines. As a matter of fact, there's a very famous development program going on now at the University of Pittsburgh called Caduceus, which takes the knowledge of a doctor, an internist named Jack Myers, and attempts to put his knowledge into an expert system. It's known as Jack in the Box among people in the field. And so this is one of the major advances in computing, is this transition from data processing to symbol, more richly complex symbols that computers will be able to process.
Okay, and that heralds major changes? Or,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's going to change the face of computing. Another major change that's going to come about in the field of computing is the transition from the traditional computer architectures, which are basically serial architectures. And to get untechnical, what that means is the computers do things one step at a time. Now, the way in which we are mimicking the biological processes that we're aware of that are part of human functioning is we're starting to look at, well, we don't process things one step at a time. We think about and do many things at once. In essence, we are parallel processors. We're processing on many different levels.
Just sensorily, even we are. As we
sensorily and in terms of our activities. So there are a number of researchers in the computer field who are now trying to make another transition, which is the transition from serial or linear processing to parallel processing, to enable computers to do more than one thing at one time.
Right, okay.
And this is where I think the future of supercomputers is not to make necessarily, they will for probably another 5 years or so, make bigger, faster machines. They might even use new materials that speed the electrons even quicker from component to component. But I think the real advance in supercomputing and in computing is going to come from this transition from serial or linear processing into parallel processing.
And we're just in the dawning stages of this transition now.
Absolutely, the very beginnings of it. There are 2, 3, maybe 4 companies that I'm aware of that are really in the advance of this, as well as work going on at Columbia University, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, University of Texas, Caltech, variety of institutions looking at parallel processing.
A great deal of this has been within our academic institutions and so forth, the research and so forth, and a great deal of it also has been within large companies. Bell Labs and others have been responsible for this, but there's also a great deal of entrepreneurial activity that's beginning to develop, and I'm wondering what some of the sociological, economic implications of some of these developments are as we begin to look ahead. If you can understand, I mean, there's going to be an alteration in our concept of labor input to the production process. What's it going to mean in terms of people's jobs and that kind of thing? You give thought to these things and some of the entrepreneurial developments of these theoretical research findings? Yeah?
One of the things that got me interested in this field, beside the fact that the future of computing lets me stay up to date in a whole series of interdisciplinary areas that I find interesting, is that for quite some time artificial intelligence and related future computing pursuits were really done at a handful of research laboratories and universities. Only in the last 2 or 3 years have companies like Schlumberger, General Motors, a variety of other, real tip-of-the-tongue major corporations started to look at artificial intelligence and related technologies. And this is because now, for the first time, there are commercial applications. And these commercial applications allow a lot of activity to go on. Some of that activity is still in the research labs and still in the universities, and some of the most exciting research is going on at some of the universities I named, and others like the University of Maryland, University of Massachusetts, and Brown University. And
from the universities, then the universities, a great deal been going on, Brown University and so forth.
Right, and for a long time artificial intelligence research was centered in the universities and the research labs. And then as these products and the potential for these products began to emerge, the companies started to get interested. And we had a mix for the first couple of years in the early 80s. And that mix was the major corporations that could afford to track these new technologies. And, as true in the computer field overall, a lot of entrepreneurial activity, a lot of startups, and many of these same university professors and researchers being recruited, both by large companies and also by venture capitalists, and striking out on their own because they wanted to make money.
Because a great deal of these information technologies represent what has been called the sunrise industries. They're information technologies, and they're the future in a very real sense, and we move into an informational environment in an economic
Well, I think
sense.
one of the mistaken notions about the sunrise industries is that they may not exist for that long. One of the promises of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence is that whether we like it or not, we're going to be freed from work. We're going to be freed from labor. And this brings me to something that's kind of a little pet project of mine. I watch with absolute wonderment as the labor unions of America seem to ignore what's happening on the technological frontiers. Labor unions have been against the home work laws that allow people to work on knitting machines at home. They have come out against what's called telecommuting, that is working on a computer, or telecomputing, working on a computer at home rather than going into the office.
Well, in a certain sense, it might be not a Luddite, but it might be a view that the technologies are going to be labor displacing and therefore displace the traditional labor workers, as it were, in terms of gaining income, so there's disquietude.
Absolutely true. Right. It is going to displace.
And it's a broader problem sociologically. It's not only the labor unions, it's the whole society has that problem that we have to confront.
It is the society, but I wonder, it's not going to be the computer companies who take the lead in terms of looking at work in our culture and looking at education and looking at leisure and trying to work out some redefinitions of these concepts. And I think the labor unions, rather than putting their hand up and saying stop to these technologies, would probably better serve themselves and us if they took a real avant-garde position. If they said, what's going to happen is people are going to be displaced from their jobs. We need to retrain these people, and maybe we don't need to retrain them for other work. Maybe we need to retrain them for the future roles that are going to emerge as a result of the potentials that these technologies make possible.
Well, it might be good to be able to have some sort of an economic underpinning to their life before we start thinking in that. Perhaps through expanding ownership? Do you think that's a possibility of some of the technology as an instrument of income distribution, and then opening on art, spiritual matters, creativity, and so forth as part of a human scenario or appropriate human behavior, or a major transformation, liberating?
I absolutely believe that the kind of hidden potential for the computer is going to be in the creative realm. And I think once we can use computers to do things creatively, as opposed to reserving them only for business or data processing functions, I think it's going to change the nature of the society we live in, and then we're going to be forced to confront the redistribution of income and ownership in our culture. And I think, once again, just to underscore that fact, I think the labor unions have a real opportunity that they haven't yet grasped. And if they take the lead, I think they ensure their own future. If they keep trying to halt the encroachment of these technologies on jobs, I think they're going to put themselves out of business, and that's too bad.
And it could be part of a pattern where, with the appropriate application of technological capability, there could be an increased size of the pie, as it were, the capital formation capabilities, what it is we're capable of doing in terms of providing humanly useful goods and services could be vastly expanded beyond perhaps the growth rates we've realized in the past, so that there could be an opening upon where maybe there wouldn't necessarily have to be forced, but there could be opportunities for everyone within the society, within what would be seen in a general sense, a liberating pattern from a scarcity-oriented sociological model that has been the lot of the human society throughout history. If you get a large systems view of the evolution of human affairs.
Well, as Buckminster Fuller taught many of us as long ago as a couple of decades, there is enough to go around. Now, that's a very difficult idea to grasp, but there really is enough to go around.
Well,
and it's our allocation and distribution where we're falling short. It's not the materials per se. Computing power just makes this doubly so. And it's going to be a tough lesson to learn, but I think in the long run, computers will help us to learn that lesson.
Yeah, well, Buckminster Fuller had made a coefficiency of haveness in terms of technology, but he had said throughout all of the human experience, right from, I don't know if it's 50,000 years or 3 million, however back the human experience goes, that those technological extensions of consciousness were adding exponentially to our productive capability, but he said we crossed that line of sufficiency or insufficiency to sufficiency sometime around 1969, 1970. That would be against the whole sweep of human history. So
I'm sure he was right.
You do feel that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think
that's a major transformation. That hasn't dawned geopolitically and so forth.
Not at all.
In a world of sufficiency.
But I think that the advance in computing and in areas like robotics and automation is going to force us to have to deal with these issues, and force us to deal with ownership, and force us to deal with the whole notion of working for a living.
Well, I hear
we may have to create for a living, and not just work for a living. We may have to play for a living.
Well, one thing might be, as I hear exactly what you're saying, and that would seem to be heralding at the time, we certainly need information to track these. I wonder if it would be a nice possibility that rather than forcing us all to do that, we might be able to see it as it's going to allow us to accept some of these patterns of success in a certain sense that we've had a hard time with throughout human experience. All of your work makes you essentially optimistic as you view the human prospect?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
despite the difficulties, right?
Despite the difficulties and despite the fact that some of us are allowed and others of us, unfortunately, will have to be forced to confront what are really very powerful issues of our time.
Well, one thing we're certainly going to need is some sort of systems understanding of what the actual developments are and what they mean in terms of our sociological, economic structuring and so forth. And for that, this new era that we're entering in terms of the computing power is not nearly well enough understood, and if there's anything we need is good information about that, and your newsletter is a pace setter in terms of that, and I congratulate you on that enormously.
Thank you.
I just really say thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And I remind you again, it's been your pleasure. I'm sorry we're running right out of time for this segment, but it's your pleasure to have had the perceptions in of Ed Rosenfeld, who again is the editor and the publisher of this really exciting newsletter, Intelligence, and tracking artificial intelligence and some of the developments of advanced technological capability that's characteristic of the contemporary moment. Happy to have been able to bring you this segment, and once again, Ed, thank you really very, very Good evening, and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very, very pleased to welcome to the program Pamala McCormuck, who is the co-author of a recently published book, The Fifth Generation, concerned with artificial intelligence, subtitle of the book being "And Japan's Computer Challenge to the World," and was also the author of an earlier book in the same topic area that was very well received, a pioneering book in this field that's moving so very quickly, called Machines Who Think. And Pamela, welcome very, very much to Conversations indeed. I wonder, maybe, could you share with us here in cable television your own development and developing interest in, well, computers and the whole field that we call artificial intelligence? I know the field's moving so quickly now, but you were almost in on the ground floor, and that doesn't have to go back very far, obviously. But maybe you could share your own, how you became interested in this particular field. Your own
yes,
background.
I was looking for a job just after college graduation, and this is in the early 60s. And somebody said, "Would you like to work on our book?" And I said, "Yes, I would." I had no idea what it was about, but then I thought maybe I better ask. And I said, "Well, it's about artificial intelligence." And I said, "Oh, what's that?"
Yes, right.
And so, in fact, I worked on one of the earliest publications about artificial intelligence, which came out in 1963.
Yeah, way back in the dark ages,
Oh,
almost
very
quite
dark
literally,
ages.
and yet it's not very long ago at all.
Right.
But it was the very beginning of what was to be called that field. And you had done work, you were a novelist, or had done work in language in general?
In those days, I was just your basic English major looking for a job.
Right,
and as it turned out, later on, I was to go on and write novels and publish them. But after I published a couple of novels, I found myself being drawn back into the whole computing milieu, particularly artificial intelligence, and so the next two books I published were about artificial intelligence.
So that book that you wrote in 1963, or that interest that you were developing in as early as 1963, yes, was in the field of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you, and you've probably been asked by others as before, but how we define artificial intelligence and how we differentiate that aspect of the overall cybernetic or computer development. In general, we differentiate artificial intelligence from the general development. But what do we mean when we say artificial intelligence?
What do we mean, indeed?
As opposed to natural intelligence.
Right, right. Oh, it's a subject of some controversy. Usually what we mean by artificial intelligence is when a computer does something that when a human being did it, we would say, that's intelligent behavior. Then we say, that's artificially intelligent behavior. And by that I mean solving a puzzle, understanding a conversation just as you and I are having, translating languages between two languages. All those things are considered intelligent behavior by human beings, and we pay human beings very well to do those things, and so on.
But adding up a column of 10 figures would be considered, in a certain sense, intelligent, and computers have been able, in a binary way, been able to do that for some time at one.
Oh, you brought up a very interesting question, because I often make the point that 100 years ago, clerks were doing that, and they were very well paid for it, and they were considered the elite of workers, those people who were able to do that. Well, now computers do it, we don't think it's very much at all. And so intelligence, whether natural or artificial, turns out to be a moving target.
Yeah, right, I can think it is. Yeah, we also have had some difficulty with some people in the general society and psychological community at measuring what we call intelligence and the functioning of the brain, the way the brain works. Now we've got two hemispheres to the brain, and you know, the intelligent quotient notions of intelligence is generally thought, or in many people's minds, associated with left hemisphere kind of linear kind of thinking in general. Do you understand this?
Oh,
As
I know
opposed to
exactly
some
what
kind
you're
of
getting at.
Perceptual,
Yes.
intuitive, or poetic modes that are more associated with artistic creativity and so forth. Does this come in when we start thinking?
Yes, it does, because certainly
machines?
closely allied to artificial intelligence research, and some people are in both, is a field called cognitive psychology, which is devoted to the question of how do human beings think. And it turns out that we really don't know. And so we do have these IQ tests, which were invented in 1905 by a Frenchman. And I love to ask people the questions that appear on those tests, because it turns out nobody can answer them anymore.
Is that right? Is that
oh,
true?
no. They really have to do with what you know. And if you weren't exposed to the Iliad and learned all the names of the people who appear in the Iliad, then you would...
intransitive Latin verbs and things, whatever. But
you would fail that intelligence test.
You're saying they're culture bound.
Oh, they're extremely culture bound.
Do you think the general concept of intelligence, as we normally measure intelligence, IQ, and we have Mensa and so forth, is something that is valid and so forth in the human psychology?
It measures a certain kind of intelligence.
Right, okay.
I don't know how well George Balanchine would do on a test like that, but he was obviously a genius. So we don't have very good ways of measuring other kinds of intelligence.
But is the human mind, or the human brain, and the brain-mind differentiation is something we need to deal with and so forth? It's a metaphor for the computers and the developments that are going on, and is it a good one? And is it, we're learning one field from the other?
We're
They're extensions of our consciousness.
Yes, we're certainly learning one field from the other. When you sit down to try and make a machine behave intelligently, then you better have a good idea of what intelligence is all about. It just doesn't do to wave your hands.
Yeah, it might help with human beings as well.
Well, we hope so.
Yes, right.
Many of the new techniques for teaching come out of research that was done originally to figure out how do you make a machine behave intelligently. We've discovered all kinds of interesting things that we didn't know before. And when we take them and apply them in the classroom, well, perhaps they'll work. There hasn't been enough time really to delve into that yet, but that's beginning to come.
Yeah, it's just, in a sense, emerging out of the whole cybernetic science, which in and of itself is relatively new.
Yes.
And it's just the leading edge of that. And a great deal of the concern has been in the research laboratories. It's been in government-sponsored research, university-sponsored research, and there's now a transit happening as some of those research findings are finding entrepreneurial application, and it's having economic application, which might be part of the reason there seems to be so much interest in it now, then, right?
Yes.
And that makes it an exciting field, right?
Oh, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Perhaps the most astonishing thing to me is the fact that this science, artificial intelligence, which was a fringe science for so very long, is suddenly on the front page of Business Week, on the front page of Fortune. All those people who really pay attention to the bottom line are paying attention to artificial intelligence. And that amuses me immensely, that it's become so public.
Well, it's part and parcel of an emerging information age, information technology.
That's it exactly.
And that's what is been spotted by many as a tendency toward which the American and the world society is merging. We're coming into an information environment.
That's right.
And to have machines that can be, in a certain sense, surrogate intellectual workers. Is it possible to see machines, or with advanced robotics and other kinds of things we look ahead, surrogate workers, surrogate intellectual producers? Right?
Yes.
Productivity levels could be built into a microchip. Or
yes,
something of
they
that
already
sort.
are.
The implications are very vast.
Yes. They're so vast we really cannot predict. We make attempts at it.
Yes,
That's part of our baggage as human beings. We can't bear not to make predictions about the future. But my own sense is that those predictions, however wild they are, fall very far short of what really will happen.
What really will happen, and do you have a sense of what will happen, or are you more synergistically inclined toward the future, that there are behaviors of whole systems that are sort of unpredictable by the sum of their parts, that there will be rather like a birth, leaving a womb into some way that we can't predict with clarity, but that there will be a major transformation. I'm just wondering what your own sense of the future
No,
is.
my own sense of the future is exactly that the most interesting things won't be predictable, that we can extrapolate from what we know now. And those are interesting, and they probably will happen. But the really interesting things simply can't be predicted because they're singularities. They change everything. And there's no way we can predict those.
And it would be part of a broader process, a long-term process, I guess in the humanistic sense of the final culmination of the extension of consciousness. We began with the tool, the spear, and the extension of the hand in a sense, and then the steam locomotive and the other kinds of industrial things, and now we're extending the central nervous system and consciousness itself.
Exactly.
So it means that we're coming into a period of a qualitative transformation. Do you think it signals a qualitative transformation in the human condition?
Yes,
you
yes.
Do?
And I think qualitative for the better, for the far better. But I think there are people who would argue with me, and I can certainly see why they would argue.
That there could be some difficulties that would be arising out of
There
this.
will be some difficulties.
What would be some of the difficulties that you could see or are generally recognized by people in the field?
You and I live in New York City.
Yeah, so that's a difficulty, right?
I anyway, ride the subways, and I see people riding the subways who are reading comic books, not because they're cult comic books, but that's the only way they know how to get information. And I think there is really going to be a division between the information haves and the information have-nots, and that division is going to get wider and wider, and gradually, perhaps, unbridgeable. That's my worst case scenario.
That there would be a widening of the gap between you say the information haves and have-not. Would that be part and parcel of a general widening of the gap between the haves and have-nots?
Yes,
and the
absolutely.
Information being part of an economic system. So it's an economic implications in terms of sociological pattern and so forth that you see.
It will manifest itself most obviously in economics, but I think the human price, if this happens, it doesn't have to happen.
All right.
But if this happens, the human price will be horrendous, and the economics will be the least of it.
And that there would be a development of it would be almost like, what is the book with alphas, betas, gammas, the Brave New World, where they had the differentiation based upon information availability. That would be because some people are not having access to the kind of access to the information modes.
To the knowledge. Francis Bacon said it, knowledge is power, and Francis Bacon was right, and he was never so right as today. Knowledge is power.
Do you think people who are denied, let's say at this moment, access to computer systems and so forth are really in a very a difficult situation relative to their chances in the society because there's so much that's offered by that, or am I in a different way of thinking?
Denial isn't the issue.
Well, let's say not have
there are free public libraries, and still the literacy rate in the United States is shockingly low.
It's going up now. It's 25 to 35 million functionally literates in the United States. It's pretty shocking.
So there is a whole group of people who don't believe that literacy is worth acquiring.
Or haven't been able to acquire.
Or haven't been able to, possibly, but I don't know.
Yeah, all right.
I'm afraid, I fear, that some of the same kind of thing might come about with, I don't want to say computer literacy because that has a very special meaning.
I see.
But as we move into the information age, literacy is going to be fundamental to this age. It is the taking off point.
Literacy, you mean reading the phonetic alphabet is going to be fundamental?
Yes.
You don't think we could bypass it with visual technologies and Kurzweil systems and so forth?
Well, I don't believe so, but I could be wrong.
No, it's interesting. It's just you don't think it'd be possible to, in a sense, bypass
You've got to remember, I'm a writer, so
of course,
I think very highly of words.
Well, no, but you're in good company because many people do think in terms of the particularly linear structured way of thinking.
There's something about the powers of abstraction that literacy gives you that allows you to move into a different world that simply visual processing doesn't.
Yeah, and you're fearful, you really are, as you think about it, that there's going to be a problem. Do you see some way out of that particular conundrum or that problem?
Yes, I do. I think the very machines that seem to threaten will perhaps offer the solutions. That is, the computer is such a protean machine. It can be changed in so many ways that there is nothing to stop us from drawing these people who resist literacy for whatever reasons into literacy through various new ways. You know, up to now, what do? We sit kids down and we show them words and we read to them and we make them sound out the alphabet. Well, perhaps some children don't respond to that, but there may be other ways that they would respond to literacy. And the computer
now again you're saying they'll respond, if I may, they'll respond to literacy, they'll become literate in the sense of reading again, and that's the key toward transmission of knowledge in your mind, is the linearness of reading. I mean, as opposed to, let's say, filmic or something of that sort of way. We don't teach them how to look at movies or deal with other kinds of system. I mean, again, that body percept thing, other than just reading as a way of transmitting knowledge.
That particular kind of abstraction is such a powerful abstraction that it cannot be denied. We've evolved it over years since the Greeks. Now, the Greeks didn't stop doing visual art because they invented writing. In fact, they didn't really invent writing, but they invented the alphabet.
It's really the Phoenicians and the phonetic alphabet that sort of set the pattern for
off it goes. I think we should be literate in lots of things, but ordinary textual literacy is just fundamental to our abstract reasoning.
And it is alarming that illiteracy is growing at such a rate. It actually is growing in this modern era for reasons that are hard to get at sometimes and understand. And this book of yours, if I may, the book that you've written with I'm sorry.
Feigenbaum,
of course, a pioneer in the field and so forth, the fifth generation. Maybe you can share with myself and the cable what you mean fifth generation and where that fits into these questions, and particularly then maybe the Japanese challenge to the traditional leadership role American research and industry has had in this area.
Up to now, computer generations have been characterized by their central components. So the first generation was vacuum tubes, the second generation was integrated circuits, so on and so forth. Right now we are in the early part of the fourth generation, which is to say very large-scale integrated circuits, which are these huge machines used mainly by the government for weather forecasting and things like that. On the horizon is something called the fifth generation. The fifth generation hasn't been invented yet. It's been designed but not invented. And it will have a different kind of componentry. We're not entirely sure what that componentry will be yet. But what's most interesting about it is it will be different functionally. That is to say, from the first generation to the fourth generation, we have had to specify how these computers must work step by step by step. And anybody who's done the most simple basic program knows that you've got to specify every step, and you leave them out, and you find out when your program crashes, and so on. The new generation of computers will be what we call goal-oriented. That is, I will sit down with my console and I will say, you know, what I'd really like to know is why is it that some people eat raw fish, but practically nobody eats raw meat?
Oh, I see. Right.
Now, that's a very vague question.
Right.
And my fifth generation computer will examine that question and will go to many kinds of knowledge bases. It will look first of all at the human digestive processes, and it will come back and it will say, well, everybody knows that fish is easier to digest than meat. And I'll say, yeah, that's true, but that's not quite what I'm getting at. And
the computer would actually come back with a test answer like that you could present. It wouldn't factor in a lot of other answers.
It might.
Like a good researcher. I mean, it would be, what a research assistant is.
Of course, that's exactly what we're getting at.
But proceed, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, well, but you can sort of picture it along the way. So then it comes back and it says, well, there's a different relationship to gravity between animals that swim in the sea and animals that walk on land. And so the fibers are different and da-da-da-da. And I say, well, that's very interesting to know, but that's really not exactly what I'm getting at either.
What about the cultural history of the world?
Exactly.
Oh, I didn't.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, right.
And I might ask that, or I might simply say, no, that isn't exactly what I had in mind. Just as I would to my human research assistant, by the way, who will come back and say, well, what if you are yourself an animal, a human animal, you have a high need for protein, you live on an island that's surrounded by fish.
Fish, right, yeah.
This island isn't very big, so there isn't room for great herds of cattle. Moreover, the island doesn't have much in the way of forestry, so you can't cook very much. You can't take the forests down.
Yeah,
It becomes a cultural imperative that you eat raw fish.
but that would have been included in the question. The question has to be well formulated as well. I mean, you question like that in the question. I'm on an island. And, no, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. You know,
I didn't have that idea in my head at first.
Oh, I see. The computer would come back at you with some original thinking. And
No, I simply asked the question: why do some humans eat raw fish and we don't eat raw meat?
Oh, you could come up with incredible numbers of answers to that. I mean, it would
That's
be.
right.
I know a fellow once wrote a book called "Eat Not This Flesh." It was about food avoidances. Somebody got it confused with something like Mickey Spillane would have written something, but it didn't do very well. But it was looking at that particular question, you know.
But you see,
I see the difference. Yeah.
Now, a system that would help you that way is an intelligent system.
It sure is.
Now, that's a cocktail party kind of question.
Right.
Well, maybe for an anthropologist it's not.
Uh-huh.
But supposing I were asking a question like, how can I get an edge for my firm so that I can make more profit? Or how can I cure this disease? I'm a physician, and this is an incredibly complicated disease to specify the therapy for.
How can we achieve world ecological justice? Or something, but no, I 5 more. All of these are really important questions, and they can be doing in the 5th generation. I see, and you. This one of the subtitles of your book is the challenge of Japanese. We have been, the United States has been in the van in both research and I guess entrepreneurially developing software, computer technology, but the Japanese are really with MITI and so forth are challenging in a major way. That's an important question for us all to be concerned with? Or?
It's very important, and it's important for this reason. We've seen how the Japanese moved in on automobiles, how they moved in on all kinds of other industrial processes. And this hasn't been pleasant for the United States, but it's happened. They are essentially presenting us with the same challenge in computing. And if we were to lose the computing industry to the Japanese, well, that wouldn't be pleasant either. It's an at least $100 billion a year business, and that would be unpleasant to lose it. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is computing is the technology that drives all other technologies. And if you get behind in computing, you are behind across the board. Now you can say, who cares? So we become the second world instead of the first world. It does matter. It matters for our quality of life. It matters for the quality of life of everybody in the world. Do we really want to give up this primacy? I don't think so. And I would not like to see it happen. As much as I admire the Japanese and what their plans are and what they've accomplished so far, which, by the way, the Japanese program has been underway for 3 years. It is exactly on target. I've just come back from Tokyo where they were showing what they've done. They've done exactly what they said they were going to do. It's really admirable.
It's a major research and development program launched with MITI, the ministry in Japan, that brings government and industry in close working relationship, more so than we've been able to achieve within our economic
Certainly
system.
much more so than we've been able to achieve, more so than we've needed to achieve. The Japanese have very different circumstances from ours. The Japanese have no natural resources. They have a little tiny island. They have lots of problems that we don't have. And so their solution is correct, probably, for them. I'm not sure it would be the correct solution for us, but we must pay attention to what they're doing.
Do you think the solutions that we're seeking collectively as a society, the United States, let's say, in this sense, are correct? Or that there's some major policy questions that ought to be addressed? Or I just wonder, in these few moments we have left, advice in terms of the way the United States might go, having plummeted this, or, looked into this area yourself. I mean, can you see some major areas of choice for us collectively as a society?
We have a number of options that have been suggested. Almost any one of them would do well. What we need to do is get going.
Yeah, all right, yeah, right. What we need to do is get going, and also to have some basic information is a basic understanding about what is happening, what some of the promise of these technological developments are, so that we'll have a good basis for intelligently getting going.
Right.
I think there's a fear about being able to, it does allow a certain kind of simulation within the
Yes.
computer, doesn't it, too, so that you think it's a lack of will or a lack of understanding, a lack of
It's a
policy,
combination
political
of
leadership?
things.
It's a,
Yes, it's partly political, it's partly lack of understanding, it's partly inertia, it's partly arrogance. We've never needed to do it before except the old way. Why should we change now? We've been so successful up to now. And that's true, we have.
yeah.
But times are changing, and we may have to do it differently. We may have to take collective action. And Americans don't like that. They're not very good at it.
Well, we haven't been, and yet you know, the information is there, and it certainly is, just as you say, it's right at the very leading edge of concern in terms of an emerging information technology. We're just beginning to understand some of these. We haven't begun to get into some of the ideas of new economic arrangements in terms of
Right.
a technologically oriented system of actual production, which the individual labor participants have been inordinately, perhaps, seeing that ownership base could be expanded as a way of distributing income. There's a lot of things we have to
There
do to
really
increase
are.
capital formation and
Oh,
so forth. And the
just-
challenges are pretty major. And I guess that would be the mark of a period of transformation. We live in a time, we said earlier, we live in a time of qualitative birth-like transformation of the American and perhaps world human condition. And it would seem to me if we need anything at this particular time, it's good, basic information by people who've been on the spot from the very beginning. If I may say so, Pamela, it's been yourself. It's been there in a very real sense right from the very beginning of this, writing lucidly, particularly for great numbers of us who are, you know, outside of that field, but with true, you know, concern and feeling for the people who are doing the leading edge research and providing a vital link in terms of helping to make these developments, the cognition of these developments by the general citizen. You're helping in that way, and I wish you all the very best as you,
Well, thank you.
help us as we move into this information environment that's growing about us.
Thank you.
And I certainly want to thank you for participating in this series. And I would like to, in the cable television audience, remind you, sorry we're running right out of time, but I would like to remind you, handsome book, The Fifth Generation, written by Pamela McCormuck and Edward Feigenbaum, who is the pioneer in this field, Fifth Generation, Artificial Intelligence, Japan, Computer Challenge to the World. Recommended, important reading. I hope that you enjoy it. And we certainly would like to invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back next week, but I'm sorry, that's it for this particular session. We'll see you again next week. And Pamela, once again, thank you very, very much indeed for participating in the series and for all of your good work over the years, and may you prosper on into the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you next week. Thank you very much for viewing, and hope that you might have enjoyed that. I know we feel as though we're only just getting started in terms of learning this interesting aspects of this interesting field, artificial intelligence, and we'll be doing more on that. Sorry we're running right out of time, but I did just want to say good night and thank you again for viewing the Conversation series, and we invite you to tune in again next week, and we will, as we say, be covering this field in greater depth. There's a tremendous amount that can be done following the developments, and there's a great deal of learning to be done by us all to where we can take advantage of some of these technologies and so forth. Again, hope you enjoyed viewing the program, and we look forward to seeing you again next week on Conversations. Good night.